So we just discussed behavioral finance theory. And one of the foundations in behavioral finance theory is understanding cognitive bias. And what I'd like to show in the next 5 to 10 minutes is that all of us are capable of behavioral bias. The human mind is simply not perfect. And here we have an illusion produced by Ed Adelson, a vision scientist at MIT. And what we're going to do is let's review the color of box A right here and box B down here. And what I want you to think is A darker than B. If you're a human being, it should be the case that A looks darker than B. And you would probably be willing to bet a large amount of money that this is the case. It's very clear what's going on. And that's fine. That's how the human brain determines this problem. But we got to ask, how would a computer think about this problem? Well, a computer would go up to cell A and identify a red, green, blue value for a pixel in A. And it would identify that the value is 120, 120, 120. Next, the computer would identify a pixel in B, calculate the RGB values, and identify that they are 120, 120, 120. Computer would have an if-then statement. If RGB A is equal to RGB B, true, otherwise false. So our human brain would consider A darker than B. The computer in its systematic decision-making mode would identify that A is equal to B. Well, what is the right answer? The right answer is the computer is correct. And this isn't a cheap parlor trick, it's just a fact. Our brains are hardwired to sometimes make mistakes. So I'll show you real quickly. I'll take away the framing of the problem, and you'll quickly be able to identify that it is true that A and B are exactly the same. And this may come as a surprise to many, but the simple fact is we aren't perfect. And I really like this Mark Twain quote, or at least a quote that is associated with him, where he says that it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's these things that you know for sure that just ain't so. And it turns out, in many respects, that it's our most confident decisions that are usually the decisions in practice that cause us the most problems, not only in investing, but across our lives. Best model I've seen of the human mind described by Dan Kahneman, a Nobel Prize-winning economist who is actually a psychologist. He's got this amazing book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And here's a picture of the cover down here. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. And the story of this book is as follows. The traditional view of economists is that humans are rational beings driven by rationality and a desire to simply maximize utility. And these people, or these things, are jokingly referred to by Dick Thaler in his book Nudge as econs, or what I like to call economan. And the research-informed psychologist's view is that humans are actually driven by two thought processes. System 1, which is an instinctual, heuristic-based gut reaction system, which is great because it's super efficient and critical to survival, at least in the past. The downside, of course, is that it's sometimes prone to error. Whereas System 2 is a very rational, analytical mindset that is great because it weighs costs and benefits and makes the rational decision. But the downside is that it is inefficient and extraordinarily slow. So one of the ways in which System 1 screws us up is in the form of overconfidence. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to identify your 90% confidence interval for each of the following 10 questions. And what this means is you are to find the lower and upper bound such that you are 90% confident that your answer will fall in between your upper and lower bound. On average, you should only miss one of these questions. And at this point in my life, I have tested this on over 1,000 people, and most people miss at least 50%. So even though I've told you that you will be overconfident, go ahead, spend a minute, and see what you can get. So now you have the answer, so on your own time, go ahead and collect your final score. If you're a human and by nature extremely overconfident, you'll probably will have missed at least 4 of these. But don't worry, you're not alone, because we're all overconfident. So another way in which System 1 causes us all kinds of angst in the world is related to anchoring. And anchoring is this situation where random information in the environment can actually influence our decision making. And in this study right here, which is taken from the Journal of Consumer Research, the authors anchor people on an irrelevant piece of information, the last 2 digits of their Social Security number. So in one control group, they ask people what they think this toaster is worth. And on average, people say, well, it's worth 30 bucks. And in the other samples, they have people announce their last 2 digits of their Social Security number. Those that have a low Social Security number think that the toaster is worth less. Those that have a high Social Security number, over 50, think that the toaster is worth more. So even though the last 2 digits of one's Social Security number should have nothing to do with the value that one is willing to pay for this fancy schmancy toaster, turns out that it has everything to do with how much one will pay for the toaster. And this is a scary influence because it happens at a subconscious level. So, how might this apply in a finance context? Well, imagine you're doing a discounted cash flow model down in your home office, and one of the last figures you need is a revenue growth projection. One of the numbers that has a huge bearing on the outcome of your discounted cash flow spreadsheet. So in scene 1, your daughter comes down and says, Daddy, 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 can I have $1 to pay for a piece of candy down at the store? And you say, well, okay, fine, whatever. In scenario 2, your wife comes down and says, honey, we need $50,000 to pay for the tuition bills coming up this year. Now, what's scary is that in scenario 1, you will on average tend to enter a number into your growth projection that it will be lower than you would in scenario 2. Even though what has been said by your daughter and what has been said by your wife should have nothing to do with your growth projections in your DCF model, they end up having everything to do with the projections you put in your DCF model. This is again scary because of the subconscious level of influence that's occurring. Another one of these scary biases is framing. And framing is another situation where we're easily influenced by the environment in very predictable ways, but in ways that are often not even understood or known by the one that's being influenced by them. So what I'd first like you to do is look at the 2 inner circles across these 2 boxes. If you're a human being, it should be the case that the circle in box 1 here looks a lot smaller than the circle in box 2. I'll tell you right now, they're actually the same, but because of the way these boxes are framed, it appears as though the one in box 1 is much smaller. So we'll see that with my little fancy graphic, the same size. So how do researchers further test this? Well, they ask people, would you prefer ground beef that is 75% lean or beef that is 25% fat? Even though the information being told to this subject is exactly the same, people overwhelmingly prefer meat that is considered 75% lean. Again, they are biased because of the framing of the question. You get much more powerful effects with the following example. Do you prefer a medication that has a 90% chance of keeping you alive, or medicine that has a 10% chance of killing you? Now, dying is a pretty serious maximum drawdown event, and it's scary. So even though the question here has given you the same exact drug, people overwhelmingly prefer and show strong preferences for drug number one, even though they are literally the same exact thing. Now imagine you are faced with a situation in financial markets where you have two financial advisors who give you the exact same piece of information, however they frame it much differently. So advisor one is this geeky guy named Charlie Munger who would want to talk to this guy? And he's a straight shooter and he says, hey, stocks earn 9.91% a year from 1927 to 2013, great return, buy an index, tax efficient, low fees, etc., etc. Advisor number two says the exact same thing but frames it in a much different way. Says, hey, I'll invest your stocks and make you a ton of money. If you invest with me from 1927 to 2013, your money will grow from $100 measly to $371,452. Amazing. And oh, by the way, look at this invested growth chart where it moves exponentially upward. This, my friends, is outstanding. Because these advisors have both told us the same thing, stocks earn 9.91% a year, in theory we should have no preference for one or the other. But it turns out that the better marketing advisor that understands framing is much more able to influence the investor that's trying to choose between advisor one and advisor two. Framing. A scary effect. A third one that's also very scary is availability bias. And these are all nefarious because they get us at the subconscious level. So you ask people, is it more likely that a word starts with the letter K in the English alphabet, or that K is the third letter in words in the English alphabet? If you sit and ponder that for a while, you'll notice that K words, or words that start with the K, are much more available in our minds than words that have K as the third letter. And because these words are much more available and easier to recall, we overweight the probability of their occurrence. Turns out that K as the third letter is 3 times more likely than words that start with a K. But again, because we overweight the probabilities that are more available, our system one screws up our decision. You could say the same thing about other questions. Do you think male politicians are more likely to cheat on their wives than other people? Well, we see them in the news, but it may not necessarily be the case that other men don't cheat just as often. But because they're less available in our mind, we underweight that probability. You could also argue that the type of news people watch, which infiltrates their minds with highly available statistics, may screw up their probability assessments. So perhaps someone that is buried in Fox News all day, where they're talking bad about economy and Obama, will probably think that the economy is doing very poorly. Whereas someone who's watching the more liberal version of the news, MSNBC for example, may think that's more likely that the economy is doing great because they're emphasizing only stories that are positive. You can see this in Pew Research polls related to drastic events in the world and how popular opinion is influenced, and innately their probability assessments of certain events is being highly triggered depending on the availability of the information. So you see that here in the Japanese nuclear disaster, where all of a sudden there's a massive spike in people that oppose nuclear energy as opposed to favor. Same thing here after the Gulf oil spill. Before, 2/3 like it, 1/3 don't. The oil spill happens and it's back to even. So people magically think that oil spills are a much more common occurrence than they probably are because the news is so much more available. Finally, another issue with human behavior that I think is probably one of the more powerful biases is that humans, and it turns out pigeons, are much more inclined to believe stories than they are to believe evidence. So B.F. Skinner and his crew, almost 60, 70 years ago, did an interesting study on pigeons where the pigeons would be put in a cage in a hungry state. And the cage would systematically drop them a piece of birdseed every 5 seconds. And of course, some pigeons do random things when they're in their cage, hungry. One pigeon might kick to the left. Another pigeon might kick to the right. And just by random chance, after a few rounds, one pigeon that kicks to the left might do this 3 or 4 times in a row and magically see food pop out every 5 seconds. And of course, this pigeon will develop a superstition that when we kick left, we get food. And then the researchers can try to detrain them from this bad behavior, but because it's ingrained as their mind as a story about how the world works, it's very, very difficult, even in the face of overwhelming empirical evidence, for these pigeons to change their mind. Now, I would argue that in investing, this is an overwhelmingly powerful effect on the marketplace. People love stories, not necessarily in love with evidence. One classic example might be 52-week low stocks, which can be considered by academics the low momentum securities. So a lot of value players like to screen on 52-week low because they're quote-unquote cheap. Well, it turns out that if we screen systematically on a basket of firms that have been doing terribly over the last 12 months, that basket of firms on average is a terrible place to place bets. And yet people use this as a screen all the time. Again, story-based, not necessarily empirical-based. So that about ends the overview of the theory of behavioral finance, and I've laundry listed a few biases with some associated evidence, but there are literally hundreds of them. And I encourage us all to go out there and read more about this and learn more about how our own mind is highly flawed.